From Maine to California and from New York to Mexico, I know a place where we can meet. It's the Joey Reynolds Show. If you're listening in Seattle or you're chilling in Buffalo, you've got a friend who's up all night on the Joey Reynolds Show. Now Joey's got a way with words. He speaks his mind, the man can move ya. And while his guests all come and go, I guarantee their talk will groove ya. So if you're up in Boston or you're down in St. Louis, Mo, you've got a friend who's up all night. You've got a friend who's up all night. You've got a friend who's up all night on the Joey Reynolds Show.
I got Celia Farber here, and she's controversial in a way in that she's telling the truth and giving her views on her long-time study of HIV and AIDS, which are both maybe non-exclusive. And also Marc Siegel, who's a doctor at NYU primarily, and you maybe have seen him on TV or read his stuff. He's pretty famous. And we have Stephen Davis, who wrote a novel. I never met Steve before. He wrote Wrongful Death, the AIDS Trial. Is this very much like Larry Kramer's Normal Heart?
No, sir. No, that is a fictitious courtroom drama.
Yeah.
As if the entire HIV-AIDS AZT question had been taken to court, and what would be said and what the outcome would be based on over 900 scientific and medical research papers that are included in the back of that book. For example, to show that HIV cannot cause AIDS, that it fails every single medical and scientific test to be called the cause of AIDS, and that the only reason we believe that HIV causes AIDS is because Dr. Robert Gallo stood up at April 23rd, 1984, at a press conference and announced that without having submitted his work to any peer review or to have any collaboration. And so my book takes a look at what would happen if we took this question to trial, what would be said, what the witnesses would say, and it gives the public an opportunity to find out what exactly has been happening for the last 22 years on this issue.
Now, Celia, you were talking before the break.
Yeah.
We have a little cliffhanger here. You need to do that unfinished business. Is HIV and AIDS, are they the same thing?
To answer it very simply, there are thousands of AIDS cases, meaning extreme immune deficiency with no sign of HIV. And there are countless millions of cases of HIV-positive people who are now going into their 20 years and counting with no symptoms of AIDS. So no, HIV and AIDS are not synonymous. Does that answer it?
Yeah, sure
Okay.
It does. How about Mark? What do you think?
To add, well, I think the term spectrum of disease has to be brought up, which is, when this all started, there was a perception that it was a uniformly deadly disease, as Celia said it a little while ago. And it's become clear over time that either it's evolved or it was being looked at in a hysterical way to begin with. But HIV is not automatically a death sentence, which is what it was perceived at back in the early 80s. Now, why that is a very curious question, but one thing that I don't have as much problem with as probably the other guests is that I've watched it clinically very closely over the past 20 years in patients, and I'm actually satisfied that the way it's approached by traditional medicine, at least in this country, has been fairly successful. And I'm not talking about how it's talked about or how it's perceived or how fear tactics are used or what your real risk is. I'm talking about people that come in that are HIV positive, that are tracked by clinicians that are not, that are not necessarily politically laden, that are just doctors trying to take care of people. I have noticed that in the institutions where I work, there have certainly been a lot less sick people. Now, why that is a curious question, but I'm not automatically assuming that the medications that have been developed don't have a use, or that the tests that are used by clinicians don't have a use. It's not the same thing as what we're talking about right now. In other words, good doctors that I work with use these viral loads and use these T4 counts and follow people clinically and treat them with poison, essentially, and they stay alive and they do okay. Now, it's interesting. They may very well, by this discussion, be over-treating people with these poisons. But I know plenty of good doctors that back off and don't treat with these drugs automatically if the patient is doing well. So there are doctors out there who have learned how to treat these diseases, this disease or spectrum of diseases, that are not politicians, and they do better than the ones that are out there broadcasting all of these. The biggest problem I find with public health is the need to say these grandiose things and convince everybody you're right, and everyone who goes against you is wrong. That's a big problem.
Joey, I need to bring up the fact that in the recent issue of Lancet magazine, there was a study published that was the consummate study about these retroviral drugs, the antiretroviral drugs, called HART. It stands for Highly Active Antiretroviral Therapy. And that study studied 22,000 patients over 10 years, and their result was that those drugs do not change in one iota the mortality rate. In other words, people still die despite the drugs. Now, after 10 years, we are finding out that the drugs we are giving these people are just as dangerous as whatever might be causing AIDS to begin with. Let me give you another example. There's a website called staynegative.org. If you go there, you find pictures of men, one of them in a diaper. Their faces are sunken. They've lost the fatty tissue in their faces. They've developed this distended abdomen or pot belly. They have lumps on their back and their neck. This is called lipodystrophy. The title of that website is HIV Not Fabulous. And anybody that goes to that website would look at those horrible pictures and say, oh my God, is this what HIV does to people? But lipodystrophy, Joey, is not a symptom of HIV or AIDS. It is a side effect of the HIV drugs that are being taken. The title of that website needs to be, correctly, HIV Drugs Not Fabulous. And the people who are surviving the best these days, as was admitted recently in Toronto at the big AIDS conference, are those who do not take those antiretroviral drugs. As Celia mentioned, the 1 million or so people who have been HIV like Magic Johnson, who have been HIV positive ever since the beginning. Compare that to Arthur Ashe, who at the prime of his life as the top athlete was given AZT, and within 3 years and 3 months he was dead, along with 300,000 other HIV positives that were given this lethal drug, this chemotherapy called AZT. Now, 90% of all AIDS cases up through 1997 were as the result of being given AZT. AZT is what caused their AIDS, not some retrovirus called HIV. Now, my question is, after 25 years, after $200 billion, why don't we have a cure or a vaccine for AIDS? We have the best and the brightest minds. We have the most money we've ever thrown at anything. Don't we owe it to these people that we're calling HIV positive? Don't we owe it to them and those who are dying to step back and say, wait a minute, maybe we don't have a cure or a vaccine because we have the wrong cause? And I believe Bill Gates and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett are throwing $237 million down the wrong path, because as long as we don't have the right cause of AIDS, we'll never find a cure and we'll never find a vaccine. And we need to step back from this and say, what has happened? Let's find out what actually is causing AIDS, and then let's address that.
All right, now hold on. We're going to take another break. We'll come right back. Joey Reynolds Show from New York. Wrongful Death is by Stephen Davis. Be right back. Now, Celia Farber is here tonight. She's done an awful lot of work for many years on the AIDS and the HIV virus, finding out where this is and putting it in order and in perspective and clearing up some of the gray matter, the smoke, and some of the misconceptions so that we could have some clarity. Am I saying this right?
Yeah, perfect. This is a conversation that had we all been able to really have this out in the open 20 years ago, a lot of things could have been different. But there were forces that blocked it, and they were very good, but they're not really able to do it anymore.
This is really your ball right now, because you opened a can of worms with truth and presentation of information as you understand it. And right now you put out a couple of thoughts, and with most people we want to know this. America, they always say, "What's the bottom line?" We always want, "What's the bottom line?" There's no bottom line. It's in process right now. Is that right? I mean, the AIDS jury is out.
Bottom line is I love the word perestroika. I heard you talking about Gorbachev earlier.
Yeah.
What I'm for, what I'm fighting for, and what I think I'm living and seeing is a reopening of a debate that was prematurely closed, a perestroika, a loosening of the terror and the punishment against those who would like these questions to be asked. That's it. That's not it, but that's my main passion. Is can we have a relaxation so we can talk about it on the Joey Reynolds Show and elsewhere? Talk about it. And not have people who want to talk about it, report about it, research, look into it, be punished. And they've been severely punished. And I've documented a lot of those punishments, and I've been punished. We've all been punished. It's ridiculous. This is democracy. This is democracy. Democracy in science.
But the jury isn't out, Joey, on a number of things involved in this issue. For example, we've touched tonight on whether or how HIV is transmitted. And there is a study, a very famous study, the longest and largest study ever done. It was done by a scientist named Nancy Padian, and therefore it's called the Padian study. And what she did was she took 175 couples they're called discordant couples because one of the couples is HIV positive and the other is HIV negative. And she watched them, some of them for 4 years, some of them for 6 years, to see how many sexual contacts were necessary for the HIV negative person to become HIV positive. Do you know the outcome of that study?
No.
Not one of the HIV negative people became HIV positive. Not one. Even though 79% when they came into the study were not using condoms, 25% were not consistently using condoms at the end of the study, and 39% were performing anal sex. Not one, Joey. There is absolutely no evidence that HIV is transmitted through sexual contact. In fact, this study proves that it's not. The study I mentioned earlier, proving that there is no decrease in mortality for the HAART drugs. The jury's not out on that. The jury's in. The jury's come back. The jury has come back on the fact that HIV, it fails every test to be called the cause of AIDS. The very first test, Joey, is a very simple requirement that in every case of the disease, you have to find what you think causes it. But we have, as Celia mentioned earlier, thousands of cases on record of AIDS with no HIV and no HIV antibodies. HIV can't be found anywhere. Well, if I came to you, Joey, and I said, Celia's got tuberculosis, but she doesn't have the tuberculosis bacteria, you'd laugh at me. Mark would laugh me out of the studio here. But we have thousands of cases on record of that. Now, what the CDC did in 1991 is they created a whole other disease nobody's ever heard about called ICL. And since that time, since 1991, anybody who has symptoms of AIDS but does not have HIV is reclassified as ICL instead of AIDS, so they could maintain this consistency. It's a false consistency between AIDS and HIV. So the jury can be out on some of these issues, but it's very clear from all the evidence. See, I got into this because I started reading the studies. I stopped believing what I was being told by the government and the media. And I started reading the studies themselves. And very honestly, people will come around and they'll tell you, well, this is this and this is that. But when you read the study itself, you find out it's simply not true. I have, as a matter of fact, if I can find that quote, yes, the Health Research and Educational Trust on their website says, and I quote, diagnosing patients as early as possible and linking them to care greatly reduces HIV-related morbidity and mortality and increases quality of life for those living with HIV. And yet, the study that just was released in Lancet magazine proves that that is false. But have they changed their website? No. They will keep lying to us about the effect of HIV drugs, as they have about many other things.
It seems like the government is writing a bigger novel than yours. John in Oakland, California is on the air with us. Hi, John. How are you?
I'm doing good, Joey. I really appreciate you having these two guests because I think they provide a very good counterbalance to some of this hysteria about AIDS throughout these years.
May I stop for a minute? There's three. You know, we got also Dr. Marc Siegel is here.
Yeah, Dr. Siegel sounds like a reasonable fellow too, and I apologize for omitting him.
Right.
But Celia and Mr. Davis are the ones that I'm really excited to listen to. And just one example, I mean, Mr. Davis has a book out about this fictional AZT trial, and AZT is one of the most toxic drugs known to mankind. All it is pure cancer chemotherapy that they're giving to all these people, and there's a good argument that this drug kills your white blood cells because most cancer chemotherapy is immunosuppressive as well. So these two guests really need to be heard, and I think they're doing a great job, and Celia's reporting on this has been courageous, and I just hope to see more of her work.
Thank you. And Mark, what do you think of this?
Well, you know, at the risk of getting throttled by the guest next to me, I do want to say that I don't agree with everything that has been said. Now, and in a way, that's in the spirit of this discussion, which is we want to avoid, you know, just doing what the other side to this discussion does, which is to make statements and leave them unchallenged. Now, first of all, he said some very smart things, and one of them I want to reiterate and emphasize, which is these drugs are toxic, and anytime a physician prescribes drugs, the physician has to take that, or should take that into effect. What am I doing more harm with, the disease or the drug? And that's why a good clinician that's treating HIV or AIDS thinks about, does this patient really need this drug, and is there a benefit? Now, as I said at the outset when I first got on the show, I have the benefit of my own experience. I've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of HIV patients over the years. And I have to tell you, my experience goes against some of the things you've heard. I followed personally from the early 1980s to the late 1980s a group of prostitutes in New York who gradually became sicker. And why were they becoming sicker? They didn't get this from walking down the street. And I felt, you know, that there was a very sick population. Now, the next point may be a total coincidence, but I've also discovered that in the past 10 years, since the drug therapies have come around, or since physicians have had more tools to look at HIV/AIDS with, that there's been less people getting sick and less people dying in New York. But as we were discussing off the air, I'm not sure why that is. And I'm not jumping into conclusions that that's because we've gotten a handle on this. Because maybe, you know, when we studied the way diseases go, in Africa and Asia, there's a completely different experience with HIV/AIDS. That may be because there's something else at work there, like the public health or the adaptability to the human organism. It may not have to do with just the virus itself. I don't have the same question about the HIV virus, not that the paradigm is wrong, because I've seen numbers of patients, again, hundreds of patients, where by following a viral load and looking at a T4 count, you can actually predict when someone's going to get sick. Now, Steve is right, by the way, that there's a big spectrum of disease here that's being ignored. It's not just HIV we're talking about. It's immunocompromised people. And many immunocompromised people are labeled in an HIV category without a provable virus. That doesn't disprove AIDS. It just means that an umbrella is being put over something that doesn't belong. Last point I want to make about the vaccine, the attempt at an HIV vaccine. I don't agree with Mr. Davis that somehow the fact that an effective HIV vaccine has not been developed therefore proves that the HIV virus is not the cause of AIDS. I'll explain that. Why can't we come up with a vaccine to the common cold? It's because the common cold is changing all the time. The HIV virus is a very hard virus to get a vaccine to. It's true that millions and millions of dollars have been thrown this way, and there's really been no success and not really anything on the horizon. A lot of money's been thrown at that. It doesn't prove that the HIV virus is not the pathogenic virus. I won't say it's a straw man, because he's right to bring it up. Steve is right to bring it up, but I won't conclude because a vaccine hasn't been developed, therefore the paradigm is wrong.
All right, now wait. Let's have a call from Mike in San Diego here. Furthering that, hi, Mike. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Good. Yeah, here's the thing: is I'm hearing you guys talk about people dying of AIDS, but my understanding is that people do not actually. Nobody has ever died of AIDS. They die of very specific causes, and that those causes can be AZT, or they can be because of people running their lives down with drug abuse. malnutrition, crystal meth, and it seems like they're calling everybody AIDS as soon as they get sick, but AIDS isn't even a disease, is it?
All of that is, I would agree with all of that. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, an immune collapse that has been acquired over time, and there are many ways to get to that crash point, and that's what this whole debate is about. Is there one way to get to that crash point, or are there many ways? Most diseases, maybe one of you can correct me if I'm wrong here, are either environmental or infectious. Would you agree with that? Okay. So the real debate here is this a chemical syndrome, as some have posited? Is it a multifactorial syndrome, or is it, as the government and the orthodoxy has said, a single viral syndrome? That's what we need to look at. It would be ideal to go back to day one before we believed anything or had been told anything, and look at all the epidemiological data cleanly.
What the caller says is technically correct, by the way, that what happens in an immunodeficiency state is you have an inability to defend yourself off of things that are not generally infections in people until you're immunocompromised. We call them opportunistic infections. You're not, in fact, dying of AIDS. You're dying of an opportunistic infection that may colonize your body all the time, but when your defenses are down, then these infections take over.
Joey, one of the problems we have, I think, is there, in my mind, and what I say in my book, Wrongful Death, the AIDS Trial, is that there are really 4 different kinds of AIDS. And we keep talking about them as if they're one thing. There's what's called, what I call the classical AIDS, and that is the AIDS that started showing up in the homosexual community in the early 1980s. And for the first 3 years until Robert Gallo stood up and made his pronouncement, we all thought, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention thought, that was being caused by a drug called amyl nitrite, or its derivatives, butyl nitrite and isobutyl nitrite, most commonly called poppers. Poppers was widely used in the homosexual community. It's been proven to be immunosuppressive. It also changes many classes of antibiotics into carcinogens. It is directly linked to Kaposi sarcoma, which was the hallmark disease of AIDS. There was no question for the first 3 years that amyl nitrite and its derivatives were the cause of this classical AIDS.
Wow.
The second kind of AIDS is what I call iatrogenic AIDS. Iatrogenic is a word that means caused by doctors or hospitals or drugs. In 1987, we started giving this lethal drug called AZT, not only to AIDS patients, but to people who were HIV positive but had no symptoms. They were not sick. And we gave it to them to treat or to try to prevent their AIDS. Well, AZT is also proven to be immunosuppressive, and it caused AIDS in 90% of the cases from 1987 to 1997. The third cause of AIDS is AIDS by definition. And what I mean by that is the CDC constantly changes the definition of AIDS to include more diseases. Today, it is not just opportunistic diseases. It's not just an immune system deficiency. For example, on the list right now is cervical cancer. How did cervical cancer, which is not opportunistic and not immune suppressive related, how did it get on the list of CDC diseases for AIDS? Very simple answer. HIV violated one of the laws to be called the cause of disease, and that is that no infectious virus, can differentiate between men and women. But up until 1993, we had 90% of AIDS cases that were men. Yeah. To solve this problem, the CDC then added cervical cancer solely to bring in more women. The last category of AIDS is African AIDS. In Africa, you do not need to be HIV positive. You do not have to have immune suppression. All you have to do is have 4 clinical symptoms. Chronic diarrhea, chronic fever, cough, and weight loss of more than 10%, and you're classified as AIDS. AIDS in Africa has nothing to do with AIDS in America. So we have to start talking about 4 different kinds of AIDS if we're going to make any sense, and all 4 have different causes.
All right, so Stephen Davis wrote Wrongful Death, the AIDS Trial, which I think has a lot of reality in it, but he's calling it a novel. And then we got Marc Siegel, who has a lot of novel ideas, and they call that a reality. And Celia Farber, who's been on the case for so many years now that she's become an expert and is scaring the government.
I want to give a nod to something Steve said a few minutes ago, which is I kind of agree that it's never really been answered why AIDS has manifested in so many different ways depending on the population. That's very curious, and that's not really been answered. Why Kaposi's sarcoma in gays, and why a different spectrum in IV drug abusers. And Steve, he addressed that issue, but I think that's one issue. But what the callers bringing up now that we haven't talked about tonight that really disturbs me is I don't think that we should put a stigma on any population, and that's actually one of the problems with the outset of this disease, or whatever we want to call it, in the early 80s. I mean, look, people cough on each other, so are we going to stigmatize people that cough on each other and spread colds all over the place? It may very well be true that promiscuous behavior led to a spread of HIV disease. We don't know the answer to that, but that we shouldn't have a value judgment on that. That's not the way to look at health care. And again, we wouldn't judge people who cough on each other on planes and spread colds.
Celia?
Here's what's tricky. The epidemiology of the early years that links high levels of sexual promiscuity among gay men to disease. What you also see in that same picture are high levels of primarily recreational drugs, also pharmaceutical drugs, like Stephen was talking about. How do you separate those strands out from each other? What we have not seen is AIDS, classic immunodeficiency, following along a line of sex alone without any chemicals in the picture. I haven't seen that.
No, but I do want to say that one of the things the caller is correct about is the fact that you're not going to solve this by throwing more money at it. Jerry Maguire, the movie, Show Me the Money.
Yeah.
AIDS has become an industry. A multi-billion-dollar industry.
Everything's become an industry.
Worldwide.
Everything's become one.
In this country alone, $19 billion annual budget for the Department of Health and Human Services just for AIDS. Now, Joey, we lose, and I don't want to diminish this, we lose 15,000 people a year, supposedly, to AIDS. We lose 500,000 to cancer, and we lose 700,000 to heart disease. But the budget for AIDS is hundreds of times greater than the budget for cancer research or heart disease research. This has become a real industry, and money is at the root of it.
This much I totally agree with. And if you look worldwide, we're actually ignoring the major killer of all in the world, which is sewage. Improper water to drink. Malaria we completely ignore, and we could be a lot closer to wiping out malaria if we put a lot of money towards that. We're not interested in diseases that kill people outside of the United States. That's a major problem. And within the United States, I agree with Steve, we don't have our priorities straight.
Go ahead. Dr. Marc Siegel and Celia Farber is here. Celia, we've got to wrap it up now.
Just that we're in an era of extreme viral mania.
And I want to thank Stephen Davis, who's written Wrongful Death, the AIDS Trial. You can buy that at any bookstore. It's in paperback right now. Thank you guys for the information tonight.
Thank you, Joey.
Thank you.